The existence of pirates in current pop culture confuses me a little bit. Since the 14th century, piracy has been a nefarious, albeit profitable, line of work. On the surface, attacking ships and looting from the passengers doesn't sound like the actions of a hero, and yet movies like Pirates of the Caribbean have a history of being extremely popular with audiences. Even children's programming has latched onto the pirate phenomenon, with Disney cashing in with Jake and the Neverland Pirates. The portrayal of characters such as Captain Jack Sparrow perfectly captures the movie lover's desire for anti-heroes. One of the greatest anti-heroes in history happens to be a pirate, at least according to England, who sailed for many nations, including the Continental Navy, Britain, France, and even Russia. I'm Matt Dahlberg, and John Paul Jones's absurd, swashbuckling tale makes him a hidden gem in history. Born under the name John Paul in Scotland, England, during the summer of 1747, John started his life on the sea at the age of 12 years young. As a cabin boy for the British, John slowly moved up the ranks until he was finally made first mate in 1766. He had worked 19 long years for this promotion, but gave it up once it was clear what his role was. He was a first mate, sure, but not for a traditional merchant ship or battling vessel. His ship was a brigantine slave ship, and the very business of slavery repulsed John Paul so much that he resigned from his post in short order. Things didn't get much better from there for John. He was appointed master in 1769 and held that title until 1773, until more trouble arose. A mutiny was incited against John. Thinking fast, he killed the leader of the rebellion in self-defense. While his actions were justified, John was fearful he would not receive a fair trial from the British and escaped to the American colonies, where he added the surname Jones in an effort to evade his captors. John Paul Jones still kept his flaring passion for the sea as he joined the newly minted Continental Navy in 1775. The pre-American fleet wasn't exactly up to par with the British power that was the Royal British Navy. The British were considered the most powerful navy of the 18th century with around 200 warships. Meanwhile, across the pond, the colonies were forced to purchase ships one by one, and only had a small handful of officers with marine warfare experience. Jones, being one of those such men, was given the title lieutenant. The rest of the Continental Navy elite were filled with either political appointees or hires that reeked of nepotism. This was a big burden Jones would have to deal with during his time in the Continental Navy, and led to mutual distrust amongst his peers. The differences between the colonial and British Navy would become even more obvious once the American Revolution started 1 year later, in 1776. A standard head-to-head battle would not favor the colonists. Jones and the Continental Navy knew this, and instead, most of their efforts would be spent on drawing the Royal British force away from America and wasting as many British pounds as possible. In simple terms, piracy. Nova Scotia provided early success for Jones. He captured 16 British vessels in his maiden voyage there. Not satisfied, Jones would pursue more aggressive engagements as the war advanced. Going from the Irish Sea to the main coast of England, Jones feared no man or nation. He went after everything that floated. Jones attacked British merchant vessels, sloops of war containing American prisoners, and even kidnapped the Earl of Selkirk for ransom near Jones's birthplace of Kirkcudbright. I think it's interesting to point out, while all these conquests were bold, Jones wanted to do so much more. Jones was a great leader, but not great at politics. Most of his superiors would reject his proposals of battle, and he took it very hard. Jones would almost never see eye to eye with his fellow officers before, during, or after a conflict. Even in Jones's finest moments in the Battle of Flamborough Head, Jones was fighting both his enemies and allies. The Battle of Flamborough Head took place just off the coast of Yorkshire, England on September 23, 1779. John Paul Jones saw an opportunity to capture a large convoy of merchant ships filled with supplies, a potential 40-ship prize that whetted the appetite of the fiery captain. Jones commanded a small fleet of 5 French and American ships. Leading the charge was a converted merchant vessel affectionately named the Bonhomme Richard, in honor of Benjamin Franklin's wildly successful book, Poor Richard's Almanac. Standing in his way were 2 British warships attempting to escort the civilian vehicles across the North Sea safely. 5 on 2 may seem like a mismatch and not much of a struggle, but it would become one of the bloodiest maritime battles ever involving British and American forces. In what was an extremely chaotic battle that lasted most of the night, only 3 of the 5 vessels in Jones's fleet ever engaged. Because of a miscommunication, both the Pallas and the Vengeance were unable to join the skirmish in fear of accidentally striking the other ships in the fleet. That left 2 separate battles happening simultaneously. The Alliance, which was the only ship in the American fleet actually made in the colonies, fired upon the Countess of Scarborough with 1 pass and then retreated. Meanwhile, the main battle had only just begun, between the Bonhomme Richard and the HMS Serapis. The Serapis was the superior warship with more than double the firepower as well as more speed and maneuverability. Undeterred, Jones attacked at full force, firing his cannons and attempting to board the Serapis multiple times. His efforts were thwarted until Jones made the decision I'm sure no one else on the planet at that time would make. In an act rivaling Captain Jack Sparrow for sheer craziness, or perhaps stupidity, Jones ordered his crew to ram the Serapis. The 2 ships collided and ultimately stuck together along each vessel's broadside. With both ships unable to move, the only options were close-quarter combat and cannon fire at point-blank range. The tactic shocked the British captain Richard Pearson. Seeing it as a desperate move, he taunted Jones, asking him if he had given up or surrendered. His response? "I have not begun to fight." The battle raged on for hours more. The Serapis still held the advantage in the fight. The Bonhomme Richard was taking heavy crew losses on fire, leaking water at an unsustainable rate, and the crew had completely lost their nerve. Some feared the captain had died and called for surrender amongst the ranks. Pearson, upon hearing this, asked Jones if he was surrendering. Jones's answer of no spurned Pearson again. If the Scottish-born Jones was to gain control of the situation, the time was now. Below deck, where the water was rising, captured British prisoners were freed after the previously mentioned alliance accidentally struck the Bonhomme Richard with their cannon fire and abandoned the crew again. In a move of great improvisation, Jones used the escaped prisoners to his advantage, convincing them to pump water out of the vessel instead of overtaking Jones and his crew. This, along with a failed boarding effort by Pearson, allowed Jones the time to take out the center mass of the Serapis. The tipping point came when one of Jones's men lobbed a grenade into the hull of the Serapis, exploding a large amount of gunpowder below deck, causing immense damage to the British vessel. Pearson surrendered to Jones, ending the battle. Jones may have lost more men, and the Bonhomme Richard eventually sunk the next day, but it was a victory over his former countrymen, and that's all that Jones cared about. Jones received many awards and commendations from both the Americans and the French. Jones wanted to continue to sail under the American flag after the Revolutionary War, but unfortunately the newly formed government sold off the entire navy to the highest bidder in an effort to fund their infant nation. John Paul Jones gained employment with Catherine II of Russia and commanded the flagship vessel Vladimir in an effort to conquer Constantinople and the Turks. Once again, Jones found himself fighting with his peers, and while he had some success, ultimately he had a messy divorce from the Russians amid a false rape accusation. Jones kept searching for more opportunities for his maritime passion, but desperately wanted to reunite with his adopted homeland, America, in any capacity. The day would finally come for Jones as he was selected to be a member of the U.S. consul and offer a treaty to the nation of Algeria. However, Jones would never have a chance to fulfill his last mission with America. He was found dead at the age of 45 in Paris due to kidney failure and buried in a cemetery for foreign Protestants. And that would have been the final chapter in John Paul Jones's story if it was not for a diplomat more than 100 years later. Horace Porter was a U.S. diplomat to France and a former Civil War general, and he had been searching for his very own buried treasure. He was attempting to decipher faulty records of Jones's death and incredibly old maps of Paris. When he discovered the body 6 years later with the help of his team, the results were better than they could have ever hoped for. Thanks to a generous donation from a Frenchman of 460 francs, Jones's body was mummified and sealed in a lead coffin. This greatly preserved the body and allowed doctors back in the States to formally identify the body. Teddy Roosevelt honored John Paul Jones by readmitting the former naval serviceman to the country and his final resting place of Annapolis with other great U.S. naval servicemen. Whether revered as a maritime hero or remembered by some as a pillaging pirate, John Paul Jones is a hidden gem of history. If you have someone in mind who you think should be highlighted as a hidden gem of history, or just want to learn about an undervalued time in history, feel free to email the show at hiddengemsofhistory@gmail.com with your suggestion. Hidden Gems of History could not be made without the help of so many people. This episode especially could not be made without Liberty's Kids. Liberty's Kids was a children's cartoon that ran from 2002 to 2003 for PBS that detailed the Revolutionary War from a mostly fictional perspective. The show is where I first learned of John Paul Jones. While the animations are nothing impressive, I have to say there are some incredible celebrity voice cameos. This includes Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Whoopi Goldberg, Walter Cronkite, Ben Stiller, and many, many more. I bet you would even recognize the voice of John Paul Jones. He is voiced by none other than Liam Neeson. All the episodes are available for free on YouTube. Check them out if you're curious. I'm Matt Dahlberg, and this has been Hidden Gems of History.